I'm Gillian Maxwell, and I'm a founding board member of the Psychedelic Association of Canada. This webinar is sponsored by Clearmind Medicine, and today you will be hearing from Clearmind Medicine CEO Adi Zuloff-Shani, the VP of Business Development Mark Haden, and MAPS founder and psychedelic sector pioneer Rick Doblin. They are all here to discuss traditional versus novel psychedelics and other issues related to the growing and changing international psychedelic space. I think you're in for a treat, and thank you all for being here. Today, I'm speaking to you from the Sentinel in Caslo, British Columbia, and I acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and ceded territory of the Secwepemc. Just lost my notes there. I'll say it again. Secwepemc, Sinix, Stony, and Okanagan peoples on which we are learning, working, and organizing today. I acknowledge the impact of historical and ongoing colonialism and seek reconciliation and friendship and action. Just before we start, I welcome our audience on behalf of the Psychedelic Association of Canada, and we are an advocacy organization and education focused on legal access to psychedelic medicines for all Canadians. We have in excess of 25,000 followers on social media, over 800 members across Canada. We work with leaders and elders in the psychedelic and plant medicine space and with policymakers and politicians to gain access to psychedelics in Canada for everyone. Please become a member, donate, volunteer, and you can find us at psychedelicassociation.net. To begin our discussion, here's some background context for you. Classic psychedelics, which include LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin, have been used by humans for millennia. There's a large and growing number of scientific knowledge surrounding these substances and their effects. Recently, scientific advances have led to the creation of new medicines referred to as novel psychedelics, similar in pharmacology to classic psychedelics. Psychedelic science brings together the diverse fields of medicinal chemistry and pharmaceutical science, neuroscience, and psychological medicine in a therapeutically promising, not to mention fascinating, area of research. The current psychedelic resurgence is opening the doors to the benefits of both the traditional and novel, as all traditions are being renewed and new molecules are being identified. That's terribly exciting, isn't it? Let's get started. I invite our speakers to take a minute or two to introduce yourselves, please, and tell us what you intend for our audience to understand from this discussion. And Adi, perhaps you would like to start.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So first of all, I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. My name is Adi Zuloff-Shani. I'm the CEO of Clearmind Medicine. In my background, I'm a research and development executive with vast experience, over 20 years of strategic and operational leadership in the healthcare industry. I have a PhD in human biology and immunology, and I was appointed as CEO of Clearmind approximately 2 years ago when this company started to work. What I would like audience to take home today is actually two things. One of them is to be open to new compounds, to hear about new compounds. I know that there's a lot of conversation around, let's call it for the sake of conversation, traditional psychedelics, but to really open up to new molecules that maybe you haven't heard about in the past. And also, I'm sure that everyone who is on the call is already there, but really to understand the great potential of using psychedelics for mental disorders. For me, it's something that I just learned about 2 years ago when I joined the company. But I really have a very strong belief that psychedelic treatments can really change the way we treat mental health disorders. So I hope you will be excited, at least as I am, about that.
Thank you, Adi. Mark, please go ahead.
Well, thank you. I'm Mark Haden. I worked for years with Rick. Hello, Rick. In the context of MAPS Canada, I worked in the addictions field before that and was acutely aware that we need help. Addictions treatments don't work very well. And the more help that we can get, the better. And psychedelics are promising. And I love having this discussion because we're continually talking about ways of improving a variety of things from mental health treatments to spirituality. And I enjoy the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Please go ahead, Rick.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Rick Doblin, a wannabe psychedelic psychotherapist. And, you know, that's been my 51-year quest. So after, I'd like people to know that, so I'm the founder president of MAPS and also PhD from the Kennedy School of Government in the policies regarding regulation of medical use of psychedelics and marijuana. And I'd like people to know that the traditional psychedelics are moving towards FDA and regulatory approval around the world. We're now projecting an August date for FDA approval. We can't say for sure, but that looks really good. And then shortly after that would be MAPS moving to Health Canada and also to the Ministry of Health in Israel, because our phase 3 studies took place in Israel, Canada, and the US. Then we'll move to Europe, and there's also Australia and England. And so I'd like people to really understand that, as Adi was saying, that I think psychedelic assisted therapies will revolutionize psychiatry and psychotherapy. And when I took MDMA in 1982 for the first time, I was shocked. It was something uniquely different than anything I'd ever done before and incredibly powerful. And so maybe there are new opportunities from novel psychedelics that would be similarly surprising to us, that what chemistry can do to the human experience. And so we'll talk about that. Although I will say that it's I very much look forward to trying a bunch of these new novel psychedelics.
That's wonderful. Thank you all. Okay, so let's start with our questions. The first one is actually for Rick and Adi. How would you define traditional, what has been researched, classic, novel, new molecules that have not been researched? How would you define those and the difference between them and the similarities?
Rick, do you want to start? I will.
Yeah,
I
sure.
will follow your answers.
Okay, so I would say that I want to first off make a distinction that I think is false, which is this idea between natural and synthetic. So I think that a lot of people have this romantic attachment to, if it's from nature, it's good. And if it's from the lab and it's from humans, somehow humans are, and it's bad. And so all of these drug policy reform initiatives that are happening in the US that are like the Colorado Natural Plant Medicine Initiative, that's going to be on the ballot in Massachusetts in November, the Oregon psilocybin initiative, all of those are for plant-based psychedelics and not for synthetics, because when you add them, the polling shows not enough people are for it and they would fail at the ballot. So when we talk about traditional psychedelics, I think most people might think, okay, that's plants that have thousands of years or substantial history of indigenous use in different religious contexts. But I would like to just expand that to say that the traditional would also be LSD, now formally discovered in 1943 with its psychedelic properties, MDMA into the 70s. So I would add traditional psychedelics being both certain synthetics as well as natural compounds. And then within those, there's kind of two basic distinctions. The classics, which are considered the ones that dissolve your ego, that are like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, ayahuasca, ibogaine. Now we have 5-MeO-DMT. So these are all considered the classic traditionals, and then there's MDMA and substances that are like that, MDA, that have more of a heart opening, that don't dissolve the ego in the same way. But I would still call all those, traditional and, substantial, tens and tens of millions of people have used all of these. So, and then the novel ones are primarily going to be modifications of existing molecules, tweaking them in different ways. However, there may indeed be new molecular pathways that are very productive for psychotherapy or for spirituality, or even a bunch of these novel ones. My experience was of trying some of them is that they're better for the non-medical market. They're gentler than MDMA. They're not as profound. They're still deep, and they often don't have a hangover, in the sense that you need to rest the next day. But because they don't go as deep as MDMA does, I don't think that they would be used for psychotherapy. Mark, I know, disagrees, and we could talk about that in some good ways. But I do have some questions about some of the theories of the novel ones are more to fit into the existing system. So a lot of the novel ones are being like short-acting psilocybin or shorter versions of the psychedelics that fit more into our traditional model of psychotherapy and insurance coverage. But I think that if we get great outcomes, what we're demonstrating is that the systems will expand to provide access to these great outcomes because there's such a dire need. So, the AMA, MAPS partnered with Compass and worked with the American Medical Association and got a new billing code for long psychedelic sessions, which applies for MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine. So I think if we get these great results, then there will be accommodations. But I think some of these novels, and maybe there are new uses that I'm not quite aware of, or that will be demonstrated with shorter acting versions of some of the others. But what I most hope for is that neuroscientists in combination with drug development people will come up with drugs that aren't just slight modifications of the ones that are the traditional ones, but are actually kind of new mechanisms of action and new kinds of experiences. But that remains to be seen. And the last thing I'll say is that one of the big challenges of the novel psychedelics is going to be the safety data, and that the safety data that's necessary for FDA, for regulatory systems, it's a lot. It's expensive, and a lot of it is when drugs become medicines, they've been tested in like several thousand people at the most, and then when they're out marketed, you have the 1 in 100,000 side effect, or the 1 in $250,000 side effect, or 1 in 250,000 people. But with psychedelics, the traditional ones, both synthetic and natural, we have so many tens of millions of people that have tried them that we understand the safety profile really, really well. So I think it will be a challenge for some of the novel psychedelics or expensive to really develop. And, MAPS's phase 3 studies for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD had 200 people in them. That's really surprising. That's because we've had all of this sort of human experimentation outside of research context that's helped us to gather safety data. And, the governments have demonized these drugs as well as part of prohibition, which is part of what I've been calling our Aikido strategy, that we use the energy of the opposition. So there's been $400 or $500 million worth of studies into MDMA neurotoxicity. And we haven't had to, we've spent less than $1 million summarizing all that data. So I think with novel psychedelics, there'll be a challenge of gathering all the safety data in an economically efficient way. But those are my sort of initial thoughts.
Thank you, Rick. Over to you, Adi.
Yeah, I just want to say that Rick actually hit most of the boxes. But for me, also traditional versus non-traditional, it's how deep it was studied, how much information we have, and my belief in Clearmind, we have even for non-traditional, none of the compounds that we are developing are traditional, but even for the non-traditional, we have those that are novel and those that are completely innovative, meaning that we have, like, if you want to call it 2.0 generation, and already working on 3.0 generation. But Rick is accurate when he say that we start from the beginning. So we start from phase 1 from animals, actually, and going to phase 1 in humans, taking baby steps, but with the mission that we have learned a lot from the traditional, the more learned, more studied compounds, and now we kind of synthesizing something that, for instance, I will give an example. Most of the psychedelics that are currently being studied are hallucinogenic, which not always it will be a good side effect of the drug. Our compound is not hallucinogenic. Our product compound is not as potent. So we have learned from traditional compounds when we came to work on our compounds and said, let's try to take the best from the traditional world and maybe try to make the compound more safer. So people maybe can take it in different ways than the traditional. So that might take out on traditional versus non-traditional psychedelics.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
Sorry.
If I could add one point, so I didn't mean to interrupt, but just this idea of non-psychedelic psychedelics is very interesting. And so there may be a whole host of new drugs that have are for neurodegenerative illnesses or other things for which you don't need the psychedelic component. It sort of, the new word has been neuroplastogens that promote neuroplasticity, neuroregeneration. So I think there is a lot to be gained from non-psychedelic psychedelics. But I think one of the big questions in the field, and I'll say what my prejudice is that the content, the hallucinogenic or psychedelic content, for many people is a key to healing because it's about making meaning of their lives. But I do think that this area of non-psychedelic psychedelics is worth exploring. And one of the frustrating parts for me was a few years ago, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Association, or part of the Pentagon, gave $26.9 million to Brian Roth at the University of North Carolina to develop non-psychedelic psychedelics, to sort of take the psychedelic content out of it. And all that is fine, but I wish they would have given an equal amount to psychedelics that we know
Yeah.
are very effective, but they didn't. So, but I think that is, you really brought that to mind, that there are a lot of ways to potentially see value in non-psychedelic psychedelics for neurodegenerative diseases and other things.
As long as you guys don't take away all our fun. Okay, so why do we need novel psychedelics?
Well, most of them, I would say, and this is not to be saying about Clearmind, but most of them, I think, are to raise capital. It's difficult to patent the traditional psychedelics, but there's all sorts of new ways that I'm learning about where you patent the manufacturing process and you end up blocking generics. But I think the advantage of novel psychedelics are that they can be patented, and then on the basis of that you could raise money. But I think we won't really know, and I'm curious, Adi and Mark, what you'll say, but we won't really know why we need novel psychedelics until we try one that's like, wow, this is really different, this has got unique potential.
It's curious, if you Google the term candy flip in the academic literature, what you see is people often combine, it's common enough that there's the term, LSD and MDMA. And so it's curious, because why would they do that? Well, MDMA lacks a sense of spirituality. LSD by itself is kind of harsh and has some hard edges. You combine the two, and what you have is a spiritual experience that's soft, loving, and warm. So that's an example of where the anecdotal literature from recreational use is actually pointing us in the direction of the need for new substances. I mean, wouldn't it be cool if we could actually tweak the amount of love in an experience, or the amount of spirituality in an experience, or feelings of safety, or feelings of reflectiveness and self-disclosure and connections with others? What would happen if we had a dial and we could say, well, I would like X amount of this, X amount of that, and then we could divine or create new molecules that met those exact needs? I think that would be pretty fantastic.
Well, but Mark, that's really a good point, except for the fact that we already can do that. It's like, how much MDMA do you give to how much LSD? you can adjust the proportions of that. So, maybe there is some other ways to do this with new molecules, but you are pointing to the fact that people do combine things to get something unique from what's already existence, but they're already combining them.
Are they combining them in the context of clinical trials?
No, because that's going to happen later, because in clinical trials, you need one variable at the beginning. So we will get MDMA approved. Other people will get psilocybin approved. There are some people thinking about LSD. And once they're approved, then there'll be these combinations.
Good. How does
I just feel that patents, and which is actually a tool to raise money. We all need to raise money in order to conduct clinical trials. So I don't see a patent something that we need to be ashamed of. But for me, as a scientist, I'm not a CEO of the company because of my financial background. I'm coming from science, and for me as a scientist, my dream is to bring good, effective, and safe, mostly safe, treatment to the market. And for me, it's an evolution. Everything in medicine that we have tried and experienced, we always learn more and more as we move forward, and we can develop new, more effective, safer treatments to very good treatments that already exist. So it's not a matter of just making money. It is, well, there are so many. It's like thinking there's very good options, but I can maybe make it better, and better meaning that I can make it safer to the user and maybe even more effective. So that's my drive, to bring something that potentially can be safer and more effective.
Beautiful. This is another question for both of you, and please chime in, Mark, if you want to. How does the legal status and/or social stigma of traditional psychedelics compare to that of novel ones? And how does this impact research and clinical use?
So actually, I have, I don't know if you will find it funny. I'm not sure until now whether I found it funny. Anecdotal, we have submitted an IND application to FDA with our compound, which is a psychedelic. And one of the comments that we received from FDA was, for your psilocybin, blah, 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 blah. Now, our compound has nothing to do with psilocybin. None of the letters even, there's no P in the compound. It's MEAI. Nothing related to psilocybin. So for me, it was like, oh, you psychedelic companies, we can just copy paste, comments from one IND submission to other IND submission because it's all the same. So I don't think there's any difference with stigma. I believe they suffer from the same stigma, even though, again, from my experience, there's a lot of openness, especially from scientists and leading medical centers around the world that are currently doing research with psychedelics. And if there is a difference, it's just that because of reasons that Rick already raised, we need to bring more data to the table. So our stigma is even worse, if I can use the word worse than traditional, because for traditional you already have some data. For us, there's no data, so everything is really new.
Yeah. Adi, was that the division of psychiatry at the FDA or a different division?
No, it wasn't psychiatry, a different division.
Okay. Yeah, because psychiatry is the one that has the most experience with psychedelics. So maybe they wouldn't have made such a stupid mistake. But
funny.
Yeah. Well, I agree with what Adi said. I think that there's no legal there's a legal distinction in that there is the analog bill that is meant to criminalize drugs that are similar to, in structure or effect, drugs that are already illegal. But there's not been much enforcement because it's very difficult to define what is similar in structure and effect, so that in effect, a lot of these new compounds, even though they're technically, you could say, illegal under the analog bill, they're not specifically named out as illegal. So, but they're considered that way still by the FDA. So there's no distinction when you try to make them into a medicine. But when you try to have people try them to get a sense for what they actually are, if that's part of the development plan, there's a little bit less stigma and criminal concerns, but only a little bit, because technically they're still illegal. There's just not this enforcement. And then the other thing that Adi said, I think is really right on, which is the difference in the safety data that we already have.
Cool. Okay. What are the environmental and ethical implications of sourcing natural versus synthetic psychedelics?
Well, let me say that our MDMA is made from petroleum. So a bunch of people have been like, how can you do that? You know? And we're saying, well, that's where they get the organic molecules and then they combine them. And so there may be a lot of ethical concerns that people have. From a marketing point of view, we've talked about starting with certain kind of sassafras or other plants, and then getting saffron oil, and then saying it's plant-derived MDMA, which is really false marketing, because it gives you the impression that it comes from a plant when it's not. There's no MDMA doesn't appear in nature in any plant. So, but people, if it were plant-derived MDMA or some wording that we could say wasn't completely misleading, people would like it more than MDMA from petroleum, even though it ends up the same part, and we're not using terrible amounts of petroleum and adding CO2 to the atmosphere in that way. So I think as far as ibogaine, ayahuasca, a lot of the traditional psychedelics, because there's such a big demand, there are concerns about some of these becoming endangered species, particularly concerning about iboga right now, and also peyote. Although you can get mescaline from San Pedro cactuses that grow all over the place and are really easy, and you still get mescaline. So I think there are some concerns, but I would say that we're wanting to move to a new world where we don't burn gasoline and oil for heat and for other electricity and other purposes. So I think converting all of this petroleum into MDMA is probably a better choice.
And the source.
It's curious because you mentioned that peyote is threatened, which we all know is true, but San Pedro has been promoted originally as a replacement for it. And now there was a San Pedro researcher who was on the podium recently talking about how the inundation of destruction of the San Pedro plants is now creating a problem.
Oh my God.
Personally, my approach is, where possible, use synthetics, just because they're easier to dose. They have no damage to natural populations of plants. They're predictable in a way that often are unpredictable. In mushrooms, for example, you don't know what dose of psilocybin you're going to get when you're taking a mushroom. Pure synthetic psilocybin is a predictable thing to work with in terms of precisely dosing where people want to go. So I think that, generally speaking, synthetics, if I had to vote of synthetics versus natural, I will go against the popular opinion and say synthetics give you a lot of choices that natural doesn't.
I completely agree, and I want to say that if we look at the end goal, which I'm sure that everyone around the table has the same end goal, to bring something, and forgive me for repeating myself, but to bring something that is efficient and safe to a person that can benefit from it. We have to go through FDA path, because that's the largest market, and everyone kind of look at FDA and what he's ruling out and what he accepts versus not accept. And for FDA, it's very easy. You have to have a one molecule, maybe two, but you have to speak about consistency, and you have to speak about something that you can dose every time, the same dosage. Someone who takes it knows, let's say that he takes it every day, once a month, never mind what is the frequency, he has to know that he takes every time the same product, the same dose, the same everything. So for me, it's not even, it's not even a discussion. It's clear that it has to be synthetic because, again, the endpoint, I always look at the endpoint, is to bring something effective and safe.
I would add one kind of more I don't say complicating necessarily, but that where there's rapid feedback, where you get rapid feedback, you can have patient self-titration. So for example, with cannabis, taking it through the lungs, you can tell within 5-10 minutes what your level, how high you are. And let's say we're talking about medical uses, and then you can adjust the dose. And so the cannabis doesn't need to be as precise, and isolated cannabinoids, I don't think are not quite the same. And so I would say similarly with ayahuasca, there's been a bunch of discussions about how would we medicalize ayahuasca. I was just approached a couple of days ago by people that are interested in a whole pharmahuasca approach where it's completely made out of synthetic molecules, MAOI inhibitors, and then the DMT. And it doesn't quite feel the same as the ayahuasca tea. So I think with the ayahuasca tea, you can adjust the dose. It takes longer than 10 minutes or so, but you can still adjust your dose. And many people do then take multiple cups of tea or more. And so I think there are some ways in which the plant-based sources will be preferred by a whole bunch of people over the pharmahuasca, and that may be true for other things, but it really works where there's rapid feedback. So you can do this patient self-titration, like for where Mark was talking about with the mushrooms, that can vary quite a lot off the same little patch. You can have mushrooms that are quite different in potency. That's harder to dose properly because you don't have such rapid feedback, but still I think there'll be and I actually don't think that the outcomes will be different in mushroom extracts or synthetic psilocybin. There may be other medicinal properties in some of these other compounds that are in mushroom extracts, but all in all, I think there may be some isolated conditions where the plant sources are perfectly fine to go through the FDA.
You just mentioned San Pedro, which is Wachuma, being perhaps scarce, which I didn't know about. Has it been synthesized?
But yeah, you can synthesize mescaline, absolutely.
Okay, so that's what the active ingredient is. Didn't know that. Thank you. All right, Rick, what has it been like for you to pave the way and now have other clinical trials following in your footsteps?
Well, part of that is great. I mean, just to see that there's been a whole change in attitudes. Yesterday, actually, I went back to the Kennedy School where I got my master's PhD, and I spoke to the mental health caucus that was there, invited by some students. And what they reported was this sea change in sort of attitudes that they've seen over the last 3-4 years, where even 3 or 4 years ago, some people were reluctant to share their psychedelic experiences. And they said now it's kind of been normalized that people talk about their experiences and that there's no stigma, it's not as much or hardly any stigma, or it's kind of a new cool thing to do. So I think for me, it's been really great to see this whole field develop, because it's never for me been just about MDMA. It's always been about psychedelic therapy, and that's what we wanted to bring forward. And so the fact that what we've done is kind of helped with paving the way and making it more possible for psilocybin to become a medicine, all of that is great. The thing that's really been difficult for me has been being a victim of our own success, in the sense that now there's hundreds of for-profit psychedelic companies doing various different things, and that's made it difficult for us to raise all the money that we need from donations to do the commercialization. And as a consequence, we've had to accept investors. And so now the difficulty is that my whole interest was doing this for the public benefit. And when you do this with donor money, they're not expecting a return. And they're not expecting you to patent things. And they're not expecting you to sue generic manufacturers to block them from entering the market so you can make more money. So right now, where I'm focused and what's so very difficult is this balance line between public benefit and private return to shareholders. And where does that line get written? And what I think that we need to do at the MAPS Public Benefit Corp, our pharmaceutical arm, which we have encountered some resistance, but hopefully we'll do over the next year, is we need to develop what are public benefit metrics and how do we measure public benefit, and then link them to stock options and bonuses of the staff. Because if we don't do that, then it's just going to be about money. It's just going to be about incentivized according to the stock share price, which is not the same as maximizing healing. It's not the same as, at least with the Benefit Corp, because of the MAPS influence, we are, the Benefit Corp is not saying they're against legalization or that they're against decrim or they're against these new initiatives. But I think a lot of the for-profit companies, if we're not careful, we'll start saying stuff like, these drugs are too dangerous for people to have access to on their own. They should only have access to them under therapeutic supervision or under a religious context, and to make them legally available to people to do at parties or whatever they want. That's way too dangerous, and we should shut that down. Where behind some of those kind of statements might be their worry that, decrim and legalization, legal access could be bad for the business model. I personally think it's good for the business model, because the difference is the business model will be covered by insurance, and people will be able to go, and most of the cost is going to be for therapy, not just for the drug. But that's a debate. So I guess it's a complicated answer to your question, Jillian. How do I feel? Mm-hmm. I feel terrific just to see the cultural change, but I also worry that capitalism will, enter into this in different ways. And what one of our potential donors said is that we're on the knife's edge between altruism and capitalism. Mm. And so that's the kind of concerns that I have. Where does this balance point get set?
The irony, though, isn't it, that we're talking about medicines that lead us into being more connectivity with each other and less duality. And so it just seems to me, so I know there's this pressure to make money and all of that, but don't those people use the medicines themselves?
We have a lot of people from pharma that have not used psychedelics. That they've been hired for their skills in commercialization of products. I mean, yeah, even the language that's being used. We don't have a drug treatment. We have a product.
No.
So you see a lot of that kind of thinking is, they're still, motivated by some of the things, that Adi was saying, is like help people with, more effective and safer medicines. But I think they're, it's a tension.
Yeah.
I mean, it's curious because I have noticed, Rick, your successful fundraising, and you've blazed the way and have been the primary donation source for people to donate to. I mean, not the source, but the recipient. Yeah. And so I've worked in your world, and now I'm working in the Clearmind world, and I'm acutely aware that nobody will ever be as successful as fundraising as you've been for psychedelic research. And the way forward, I actually firmly believe, is actually through business models. And I don't think business models necessarily are bad. They just have to be held to the ethical, their feet need to be held to the ethical flames in order to make it all work. Personally, I'd like governments to step up and actually start funding this stuff, and academic institutions to start funding it as well, because they can see the benefit, and it's really, really expensive. It's hard to pull together the millions. Your work fundraising has been remarkable, and I don't think that'll ever be duplicated by any other organization.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think I could even duplicate it going forward.
Yeah,
that's
difference.
But I do think, Mark, you've been great fundraising for MAPS Canada also.
Yes.
And but just as a point on this, so MAPS will have raised in donations somewhere in the neighborhood of around $170 million. Oh. But over the same last bunch of years, there's been well over $2 billion raised by for-profits. So just the scale of things is an order of magnitude greater, the resources that are coming into the field from investors rather than from donors. And as far as government money, I'll just say that there is an effort right now from the state of Kentucky to allocate $42 million for ibogaine research. And this is because there's been such damage caused to so many states by the opiate epidemic that Purdue Pharma, the Sackler family, and others, some of the distributors, have had to pay billions and billions of dollars to the states in penalties for the damage that's been caused. And so Kentucky is getting $840 million. And so they're talking about 5% of that, $42 billion, potentially for ibogaine. And even that is not sure. And even if they do that, it's going to be a matching grant. It's not going to be just 42 million. So there is hope that if Kentucky does that, then other states might be willing to do that with some of their billions that could be used for the match. And if that all happens, then we could conceivably make ibogaine into a medicine with open science, no patents, and have it immediately become a generic. So that's my hope for ibogaine, but that's going to require public funding.
Fingers crossed on that one. Thank you. So this is for both of you. What are you noticing in the world of psychedelic science and business that is of interest? Maybe we touched on that already. Wait, do you want to go ahead, Adi?
Yeah, I think so too, that both Rick and Mark has already touched about it, but I think that for me, as I said, money and patents or whatever is a tool. I see the end where I want to be, and I need to bring tools in order for me to be able to get the company to get where we want to get. So I see, unfortunately, we don't live in in this wonderful world where there's money that just governments are spreading on good initiatives. And so we do need to raise capital, and I think that companies or a business model is one way to raise capital and really advancing what you believe in. I don't see it very different between profit and non-profit in terms that we all need to raise money. We all need to go to people and make them believe in our story and make them believe that our treatment is treatment that's going to do some different, change the world maybe. And so I really find this mix of business with science to be the most beneficial to me, because I know how to raise money and I know how to allocate the money. So again, sorry for repeating it, bringing a good treatment to the people at the end of the day.
Yeah. I would just say one of the things that's so promising is that so many new molecules are being attempted to be developed, and so much innovation is being explored. And that would not happen just from the charitable donations, which are going to more of the sure things. So I think there's a lot of potential for the business. But what I do worry about is the overbroad patents that are being used by all different companies to try to block innovation. So that's the downside of using patents to raise money. There's this aggressive use of patents, which is completely common in the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, that's the way the pharmaceutical industry runs, is you try to develop overbroad patents to protect as much, like build a moat around whatever your drug is. And it costs millions and millions of dollars to fight even bad patents. So that a lot of it is designed to obstruct the competition and then drain them of resources to fight. And then there's another challenge I'll mention that's interesting from the business point of view, is that for us, for MDMA is in the public domain. Psilocybin is in the public domain. So we don't have patents on the molecule or on the uses of it. And so what we're using is what's called data exclusivity. So when we have exclusive use of our data. So when the data exclusivity period runs out, then generics can enter the market. And in the United States, if you are the innovator company and there's a generic company that wants to enter the market, and if you've managed to get certain kinds of patents on manufacturing process or whatever, then you can sue the generic manufacturer for a potential infringement. And you get an automatic 30 months where the FDA cannot issue authority for the generics to go to market unless you lose the lawsuit and the generic shows that they don't infringe. And good lawyers will be able to keep it going for 30 months, no problem. So there's an incentive to sue generics, whether they infringe or not. And so one of the things that I've been struggling with, and this is something that is still in process, is to say that as a public benefit corp, we should make a, quote, good faith effort to see if a generic company infringes before we sue them. Now, that would require them to give us all of their package that they give to the FDA, but this is one of the concerns I have about the business aspects of this, as I see it, is that it's clearly in the best interest of the investors to sue generics, whether they infringe or not. And that doesn't strike me as in the best public benefit interest. So that's where I talk about this kind of where the line gets drawn. But my worry is that these overbroad patents will be used to block innovation and then will be used to delay the entry of generics.
But isn't there a role of government in this? This sounds like the Wild West.
The government created it like this. This is the laws that are currently in existence. And so, so also, for example, the data exclusivity in the US is 5 years, and then you get an additional 6 months for doing pediatric studies. So we're incentivized to work with adolescents, after we get approved for adults. But it's 10 years in Europe, this data exclusivity. And in America, there's no political will to extend data exclusivity so that there would be less incentive to do all these kind of tricks with patents. And in Europe, there are actually some efforts to try to reduce data exclusivity from 10 years to 8 years. So what we're talking about is government created conditions that I think are going to be difficult to change politically.
On that note, what can psychedelic companies do to promote safe psychedelic use and therefore be open about issues of drug policy?
Well, I think that psychedelics will never be safe in the sense that you think it's like, here it is, and there's no problems. Like you can take even aspirin, you can overdose on aspirin. So I think whenever you bring material to the surface, unconscious material or repressed material or, memories of trauma, or you work with depressed people, there's always a risk. And I think that one of the things that Adi, I think that you were alluding to potentially is this idea of take-home psychedelics that are not psychedelic. That there may be ways to develop non-psychedelic psychedelics that don't require administration under direct supervision of therapists. And I think that means that they're more like the SSRIs. They're more like the current psychiatric medications that work on symptoms and don't necessarily get to the root cause, and do have the successful, business model of being taken every day. So those, I think, can be done in a relatively safe way, because you're not having this strong emergence of material. But if it's like a classic psychedelic, these traditionals, it'll never be perfectly safe, because that's where the therapy comes in. So I don't think that it's the development of the molecule that's going to be the real key thing for safety. It's going to be the development of the cultural context that's reimbursed by insurance, that provides the preparation, the support during the experience, and the integration after. And I think that's what's really going to be the key to safety. And so just to say this other point, when we talk about legalization and how these should be available for people without being supervised by therapists, there will be problems. And there will be people that take them and commit suicide, or there'll be people that take them and get aggressive with other people. There will be problems because it's not as safe to do in that way. But, and this is where, Mark, maybe you could comment, it just seems to me that the counterproductive nature of prohibition is so bad that we need to accept the fact that if we go for a legalization model outside of medical supervision, that there will be problems, but they will be less than the problems we have for creating these criminal undergrounds and denying people access. And then also there'll be so much more benefits to offset these problems. But there's so I think this idea of safety is a relative term, and it's not going to come. The more you take the psychedelic out of the molecule, the quote safer it becomes. But I think it's really the cultural context, the therapeutic context, and then how we educate people in schools. Right now, the programs that teach people about drugs in schools are so skewed towards talking about the risks to try to scare people away from using these drugs that people are not prepared for using them in a spiritual therapeutic way.
Any comments, Adi or Mark?
Well, Rick and I have talked many times about the harms of drug prohibition. And one of the things that drug prohibition does is it destroys the development of social context that creates safety nets for drugs. And if we were more, true harm reduction includes benefit maximization. And so having the discussion about the benefits of drugs and how to incorporate them in a structure in society is actually a really important discussion to have with kids. But back to the issue of, does a substance need to be supervised? Because one of the things with MEI is it's being promoted as a substance that doesn't need therapeutic supervision. And so essentially, this is back to the anecdotal information you get from the underground. And there was a period in time when MEAI was sold in the underground. And it was noticed that it just helped with addictions. It helped with alcoholism. People stopped drinking when they took it. And they weren't supervised, and they enjoyed the experience. And I compare that to current treatments for alcoholism, for example. Antabuse is horrible. You take antabuse when you take alcohol, and you're violently ill, and you really don't ever want to do it again. So having a substance that's positive, that people enjoy, but it's not dramatic. They don't love it. Nobody goes, wow, this is like MDMA. It's not a dramatic experience, but it's an enjoyable experience. And it seems to have this triggering effect where people stop drinking. So it's one of those new molecule discoveries that we need to be kind of diving into the deep end to understand how this can work.
Yeah. And I just want to add that it doesn't really work like SSRIs. Mechanism of action is completely different. That's the reason why we think it will be much better than SSRIs. But I really, going back to the question, sorry for that, but going back to the question, I think that education is a key. And I think that once we really speak about it and treat it like any other substance that we have, because we can, water can also be dangerous if you drink gallons and gallons of water. So everything potentially can be dangerous. It's all how we relate to it, how we see it, and prohibition. I think it's a very bad thing, because things that are prohibited by nature, we just want them more. So I really believe that the key is education.
Non-profits working with for-profits, is that at all possible? And for-profits who have ethical integrity, is that possible? And share the MAPS vision. What are your thoughts about that, all of you?
I certainly think it's possible. And I think that, but it's not easy. When you get investors and you get, particularly then when things become IPO and meaning that they become publicly traded companies, then you have a lot of the pressures from the markets about money and stock price. And then I think ethics, if you're not careful, may take a back seat. Fortunately for us, I would say that the investors that we have are impact investors. They're not the traditional biotech investors that want 10x out of their money and want to, be in a company for a couple of years and then sell their shares. We have impact investors that care about the impact and are willing to accept lower return because of the impact that they care about as well. So I do think it's very possible to have ethical for-profits. And I think it's important for nonprofits and for-profits to work together. I think for us, this idea that that there's like, for example, these projects in Israel that are going to be that we're trying to start with group therapy. You know, that's something that is going to contribute to the whole field. And what makes it, I think, ethical is that all of the data is in the public domain, and there's no attempt to, you know, claim IP. So when the nonprofit does it, it does it with people get tax deductions, and then, you know, it's for the public benefit. And so that's where I think that nonprofits and for-profits can work together in a good way. But I think, you know, it depends on, you know, how you define ethical. And, you know, and so I so far think that there's, if for-profits start to lobby against drug policy reform, then I think they've become unethical. You know, I don't see that really happening. They're just neutral so far, but you know, that's a big thing for me to watch out. Once for-profits start to block access and reduction of penalties, then they've switched into unethical territory. And also the overbroad patents are a big problem too for ethics.
I just want to say, for me, not black or white. It's not so. For me, ethical, it has nothing to do with profit or a non-profit organization. It's something within the organization, whether it integrity and so on. I can tell you from my perspective as not just business, but also a public company. Having a shareholders, meaning that believe in the treatment that you are developing, meaning that you have to stick to milestones. It means that you have to meet a timeline. That's what it means to have shareholders who's looking all the time at the share price and what is going on in the company, which I think it's a very good thing, because it forces you to meet timelines. And for me, again, I will say it again and again and again. When the goal is to bring something from the bench to the market, as soon as I can do it, the better. So when I have this constant pressure to meet timelines, to do the clinical trial, to go step by step, to all the time I have to communicate with the public everything new that I have found, whether it's good or bad. Transparency is complete. So I see a profit organization that can be as ethical as a non-profit. So for me, it's not even a question. And therefore, I believe that we can collaborate with anyone, including non-profit organizations, because I believe that at the end of the day, collaboration will help us to bring better treatments, because everyone will bring to the table their knowledge, their experience, what they have learned, what they can do better than the other. And for me, that's the best of all worlds.
I absolutely agree, Adi, and really, don't we need more women in the field? Anyway, thank you for your comments. Mark, anything from you on that?
Well, I chose my background intentionally. It's a bit of Harry Potter and it's a bit of academia. So the combination of for-profit and not-for-profit makes complete sense to me. The ability to generate money within the for-profit and the ability to generate vision within the not-for-profit and collaborate and communicate and engage communities is actually really important. So I actually strongly support the engagement of both.
Great, thank you. So I have a couple more questions to ask, and then we're going to open it up to our audience who are paying a lot of attention to what's being said, and encourage you to send in your questions if you haven't already. So my next question is for Rick and Mark mostly, but Adi, of course, please chime in. What do you think about the blossoming world of underground psychedelic therapists? Is that a good safety data point for regulators?
Well, there's the underground therapists are the heroes in my mind of this whole movement. It was really underground therapists that developed MDMA, even though MDMA was legal at the time that they developed it, and they kept it quiet for fear that it would become legal. And also because of so much of the public attention about the positive benefits of the research that's taking place, there's a lot less enforcement now against underground therapists. However, I would say there's two kinds of underground therapists. There's the one that just took ayahuasca last week and now is a shaman. And, then there's a bunch of those. And then there's the ones that have been doing this for a very long time and who are personally experienced with a range of different drugs and who operate, in a very careful way, because the underground people have had to be even more careful than the above ground therapists so that they don't get caught up in the legal system. And, and just to say that the way that underground therapists get in trouble has not been, you would think that underground therapists get in trouble because they have a difficult patient and something goes wrong and the patient complains. But that's not actually what happens in practice. What happens in practice is the underground therapy goes well and somebody decides to make a change in their life. And then the people that are left behind are the ones that call the authorities. So, there was one of our researchers in the MDMA project that was called up before the authorities because he worked with someone in an underground way, and they moved out of a very conservative religious community, and the people left behind called the FDA, called the licensing boards and stuff. So I think that in the same way that there's a range of quality of above ground legal therapists, there's a range of quality and depth in the underground therapists community as well. And so, for those people that are thinking about working with underground therapists, I would suggest trying to find ones that have been doing it for a while.
Yeah, I think there's a reciprocity between above ground and underground that actually works well for both. I mean, MEI was discovered because there was increasing anecdotal reports that it was helpful for a variety of conditions. And so when the above ground folks looked at this blossoming anecdotal report, then reports, plural, that's why an above ground company was formed. And the underground can learn from the above ground. I look at the development of screening tools, for example, that then underground therapists use. And so I think that hopefully there's a lot of sharing of information and both learn, because the underground is not going to go away. It's blossoming. It's doing really well. I look at underground therapists in Vancouver and they're all over the place. And they're both a risk because they tend to not be regulated, but they're also a benefit because they can do things that we can all look at and say, this is really helpful. So I see risks and benefits with the underground.
Any comments, Adi?
Yeah.
What do you guys, oh, sorry, carry on.
No, I just said that I enjoyed the conversation.
Isn't it wonderful? I love having these conversations, and to have it with you guys is really quite extraordinary. What do you see as alternatives to the clinical trial pathway? Do you see the legalization of cannabis in Canada without clinical trials as an alternative?
I think it's an important step, but the key thing for medical use is that if you go through regulatory agencies, you get insurance coverage. So it may be that the Canadian government, particularly for veterans, covering cannabis for various things, even without the clinical trials, is really a good step forward. And maybe they'll cover even more of it. But I think but cannabis is the medicine itself. We're not saying that cannabis, even though cannabis psychotherapy can be something really effective as well, we're basically saying cannabis is the medicine itself. But where it's really the therapy, we don't want this to be limited to people that can afford to pay for it out of their pocket. We want this to be available to people who have insurance. And even the other part is that in America, 1/3 to 1/4 of the people are either uninsured or underinsured. So the regulatory pathway gets you insurance coverage. And so I think we'll always need to go that way, even though legalization, regulation without the research is something that we should do right away, because the drug war is so totally counterproductive.
I completely agree. And I want to point out the status of medical cannabis, not like in Canada, but in in the United States, where for FDA there's no such a thing that called medical cannabis, and that's because of lack of evidence. And you can see it also in the prescription. At the end of the day, most of the people, if it's medical cannabis, they need to go to the physician and get a prescription. And there's a lot of physicians that still, quite rightly, want to see clinical evidence. So I do believe that at the end, we do need to go through the clinical trial pathway in order to bring the to bring the data, to bring the proof, and to really put things in perspective, including to be insured, because because it can be very expensive and people may not be able to afford it, even though they can really benefit from it. So I truly believe that you can start with non-clinical trial, but for me, as coming from the pharmaceutical industry, I think that clinical trials are key.
It's curious, in Canada, cannabis was not legalized because it was on the clinical trial pathway. It was popular opinion. Justin Trudeau went to polls, and it was 56% of Canadians wanted cannabis to be legalized. And they to some extent, the cannabis activists made a mistake in that they didn't engage the medical community. And in the world of psychedelics, physicians need to be involved. I mean, the goal is to have them on the prescription pad. And if we blow it and don't involve physicians all the way along, and they actually start speaking out against us, we'll actually have a huge problem on our hands. So I actually have been reaching out to the medical community for over a decade now. I have about 86 physicians on list that I invite into a discussion on a regular basis, because we need physicians if it's going to be medicalized. And it's not just popular opinion. Popular opinion is important because we've shown that through the world of cannabis. But if you don't medicalize it at the same time, then you have a very strong voice that is in opposition to you, and that's a real problem. And just to acknowledge, there's also the whole indigenous use thing that is a pathway to legalization, of essentially saying, leave them alone. They can do what they want. And they've been doing this for centuries, and we really don't have anything to offer them. And so we shouldn't restrict them or encourage them. It should just be left alone to the indigenous folks to do what they want with psychedelics. So I see three separate pathways: sort of popular opinion, which is cannabis; psychedelics, which is being medicalized; and indigenous use, which is just fine the way it is.
There's another advantage of the popular opinion approach for cannabis, is that the same way that the regulators, block psychedelic research for multiple decades around the world, we now have a terrible problem with the FDA. So Adi, the way you described that they, talked about psilocybin when your product had nothing to do with that. We've got the FDA right now. We've got a $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan to do stuff in 320 veterans with PTSD. And the FDA has kept the protocol on clinical hold for almost 2 years, and they are refusing to let us study smoked marijuana, and then they're refusing to let us use vaporized marijuana. And in their critique of vaporization, this is going to be whole plant flower vaporized in the PACs. Their whole critique was against isolated cannabinoids in vape pens, and that's why they weren't going to let us. So we are now hiring and have hired lawyers and they're sort of scientist lawyers who are experts in disputes with the FDA. And when we had this meeting, this type A meeting with them a couple months ago, the head of psychiatry products said, I hate this term medical marijuana because it's not medical until we say it is. And at the same time, they're blocking us from doing the research. So there's this interplay between the sort of move by public opinion in the 39 plus medical marijuana states in America. There are over 20 marijuana legalization states, that it puts pressure on the regulators to stop obstructing research. So I do think we need to go through the regulators, but I think that there's a lot of public pressure that hopefully this time will help the FDA to approve our protocol. We got letters from experts and stuff, but often the regulators are blocking things, and you need these alternative approaches.
Right, but there's another angle. Clearmind is a Canadian company. I'm based in Israel. In Israel, we were really pioneers in medical cannabis, which, by the way, recreational cannabis is not illegal in Israel. what happened is that because there was a lot of movement from people who tried medical cannabis and they found it beneficial, the government started to take steps in order to legalize medical cannabis use. But now there's a situation where there's no incentive to do any clinical trials to get more information, to get more information about doses, about how long to take it, what kind of strain to use, etc., etc. I think that MAPS is kind of different in terms of that you promote studying compounds that you believe that may be beneficial through clinical trials, but usually companies just don't have, cannabis companies don't have incentive to go through clinical trials, which are very expensive. They take a long time because they can now just sell medical cannabis. It's legal. So I think that we always need to weigh things and see where, at the end, the patient will benefit the most.
Thank you. Rick, we're about to go into fielding some questions from the audience, but we spoke offline actually about the initiative in Israel, and seeing as it's so important at the moment, maybe you could just give us a couple of minutes talking about that. I think people would be really interested.
Okay, thank you, Jillian. Yeah, so after the Hamas massacres, it was just very depressing, and I started thinking, what, if anything, could we do to help out? And I realized that we had successfully demonstrated, I think, in our phase 3 studies, that MDMA-assisted therapy can be helpful for people with chronic PTSD. But what we had not demonstrated, and what has never really been researched, is could you give somebody who's been recently traumatized one MDMA experience and then have that be prophylactic against later developing PTSD? And so I thought, if we can work with the Ministry of Health and start something like this, and we could maybe treat like 400 people or so, because a lot of people will naturally recover from trauma. So you need large numbers of people to see if there's a difference between, the group that got one MDMA session and the group that didn't. So there was some support at the Israeli Ministry of Health, but also some concerns. And so what is developed instead was that we have to have a protocol. It'll take months and months and months. And so what we're doing now is group therapy for 400 people, where one group will be people who were survivors of the massacre at the rave, the Nova rave. Another will be survivors of the kibbutzim massacres, and then the other would be IDF soldiers who have trauma from what happened. And so we will be now experimenting with group therapy, and the cost of this, because a lot of it is going to be done at Israeli hospitals where they're going to provide the infrastructure, it's going to be less than $5,000 a person, whereas the cost in research for our individual therapy is well over $50,000 a person. So the economies of doing group therapy could be really substantial. It's also, the difference in cost is that these are studies in Israel that are not drug development studies, because we already have the data that we need for that. So these are more, it's an easier way to gather the data. It's not so much going to be, rigorously evaluated by the FDA. The other thing, so that we are looking, we've got about $750,000. We're looking to raise 1.9 million. And so people could donate to MAPS for MDMA research in Israel, or donate to MAPS Israel. But I do want to share that we're also trying to bring MDMA to the Arab world. And so we had a training in August in Sarajevo that was just incredible. It was for Ukrainian therapists, but we had Bosnians, Serbians, we had others. And we had one young woman therapist from Lebanon who was there. And it was taught by the Israelis. It was amazing. And what this young woman from Lebanon had shared is that in Lebanon, you talk to an Israeli, it's like you're committing treason. But here it was, she was at this program. And some of the things were so moving, the videotapes of therapy sessions, things that at different points in time, people broke down crying. And so there was this one moment where this Lebanese woman was crying, and she was comforted by the Israeli assistants that were there. And it was just beautiful. And because of that, in part, we just had 3 Lebanese therapists come to our Iceland training the first week in November. And they were so impressed by the therapeutic potential of MDMA that now they want us to do a training of therapists in Lebanon for therapists from around the Arab world. And we already have funding for all of that from people that used to live in Lebanon, Lebanese people who've now come to the US and made success. So the Israeli project is going to be group therapy, and it's going to be a really important new innovation to explore. And again, it will be in the public domain, open science, done through nonprofits. And the Lebanese project would start, at least initially, as individual therapy, because the Israeli therapists too have done individual therapy already, and that will provide them with some of the base skills to, because I think group therapy will be more complicated, again, just with groups. So the project is really to respond to the fact that we've now got a whole traumatized nation and the traumatized Palestinians. So, there's one, I guess I'll say one final thing, which was that I felt like we're lighting a candle of healing in a hurricane of trauma. And that's kind of what we're doing. But there was a quote somebody sent, when I said that, they sent this quote back from Anne Frank. And her quote was that it's the lighting of a single candle can both defy and define the darkness. So there's a lot to be done for whatever little we can do. And so that's what we're hoping to do, is just bring a little bit of light and healing.
That's
There's no, I see from Cheryl, someone is asking for a link to this project. We've just started talking about, there's no real link to it. We're still in the protocol development stage, but people could donate to MAPS Israel or to MAPS and just say group, MDMA therapy in Israel.
Thank you. It's beautiful. We have a question from the floor. What about the natural feeling from psilocybin and ayahuasca? Would making it synthetic remove that feeling? Do you know about any literature talking about that natural feeling from psilocin pills?
Well, I can talk a bit about that. I know that the original Sandoz pills that were used by the researchers way back when were seen as being fantastic. And all the current research today looking at mushrooms versus synthetic psilocybin has been looking at synthetic psilocybin, and it's very, very effective. It's interesting. In the world of cannabis, the entourage effect, I think, is a legitimate discussion, because the CBD and terpenes do add a lot to THC. But in the world of mushrooms, the things that are what else is in the mushrooms, the baeocystin, norbaeocystin, and chitin, et cetera, don't actually add anything to psilocybin. So I think we need to look at what the natural ingredient is. For instance, looking at the mushroom and saying what's in there, and is there anything in there that helps psilocybin? And my answer is actually it doesn't. I think the synthetic psilocybin has been shown by the research as being completely effective.
Yeah, and then also when people talk about having mushrooms in their research, they talk about it as, it's a natural drug, and it's and it has that same feeling, even though it's been synthetic. So I completely agree with what Mark said. The entourage effect does make sense with cannabis, but I don't think so with mushrooms. And the other things may have some other medicinal benefits, but they don't have psychotherapeutic benefits.
It's interesting, Maria Sabina, the original curanderos in Mexico, who was discovered to be using mushrooms, was given the little pink pills. And her comment was, the spirit is strong in these pills.
Yeah, same for Anne Shulgin, because the lovely Anne, she presented at the previous MAPS conference, such a wonderful presentation. Anyway, and she said the same thing. They brought when Sasha was alive, they brought the pills to them and said, please, what do you think? And they gave it the full green light. So
yes,
yeah, it was lovely.
So you spoke about cannabis, and I was lucky enough to work with Professor Meshulam, the godfather of cannabis, and he always said, he was very often was asked about whether synthetics, how to compare synthetics to natural. So he said it's a molecule. At the end of the day, it's a molecule. So if it's well synthesized, it's just. And by the way, he coined the phrase entourage effect, where he was referring to the endocannabinoid system, but then cannabis companies took it to the whole plant versus specific cannabinoids. But at the beginning, originally, he meant the endocannabinoid system.
Well, okay, well, that's the red seal of approval, right? Gold seal of approval, I would say. Another question: when will clinical trials for MEAI by Clearmind Medicine in Europe commence?
That's a very good question, because FDA has can stop you for as long as they want to. I do hope that we will initiate the study in the US. Currently we have 3 sites, 2 in the United States and 1 in Israel. So I hope we will initiate the study in the United States just before the end of the year, and same for Israel. So it's really at the hands of the regulators.
And the logic there is, if you start with the United States and you get FDA approval, the rest of the world notices. And so bagging the elephant is the plan. And then hopefully other countries will be easier to do the clinical trial process in.
Particularly, by the way, the United Kingdom, so England. Because of Brexit, the European Medicines Agency was located in England. Now it's located in Amsterdam. And the MHRA, the Medicines Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, their equivalent of the FDA, is now resource starved. And there's a bill in the Parliament to make it so that if something is approved in the US, it will be approved in England. It's not the exact same way for the European Medicines Agency. They may require some additional research, but yeah, if you start in the FDA, it has repercussions globally.
Another question from the floor: psychotherapy is mentioned repeatedly as the way to go with psychedelics. How will psychedelics be accessible to marginalized groups such as the transgender and the BIPOC community? There's several questions here. When economic and social survival is already difficult, wait list for the therapist, time to go to the session. Are there therapists who can provide safe spaces? How will psychedelics be accessible for those who need it the most?
Well, there's, I'd say now here, a big distinction between America, Israel, Canada, and England, and that is national health care, which we do not have in America. So the challenge is going to be if transgender and BIPOC people are employed in places that give them insurance, then it should be accessible to them, because we are very much trying to get it available and covered by insurance companies. And I think the benefits that we've been able to show are so great, and the costs, economic costs, emotional costs, of having untreated PTSD are really large, or untreated dependence on substances, or untreated depression. I think one of the key things for us has been this idea of training transgender and BIPOC therapists. So in addition to making it accessible through insurance, some people will be able to get it through patient assistance programs, but those are going to be very difficult, because normally in a pharma company, the patient assistance program gives the drug for free, and the drug is the thing, and the drug is pretty inexpensive to make. But in our case, it's really the therapy, and the therapy is going to be quite expensive. So it's going to be very difficult to cover large numbers of people through patient assistance programs. So I think that's where drug policy reform comes in, and that's where the underground therapists, and that's where training the public to make it really accessible. And again, this is more the problem in America than in places where everybody's covered by insurance. But I think the big step, in addition to making it available, is training BIPOC therapists and transgender therapists, so that people feel safe when they come to the therapeutic situation.
So while Americans wave their flags, Canadians wave their healthcare cards. So I was actually part of a provincial committee that was asking a very simple question: how do we integrate psychedelics into the healthcare system? And we came up with many ideas about how to take existing health programs, mental health programs, and to just to incorporate psychedelics within them. Hopefully we'll do that widely. It hasn't happened yet, but that's the track that I would like to see happening in Canada.
Any comments, Hadi? So we're actually winding down. We've got about 5 minutes left. And I think oh no, there's a question. There's another question. Here it is, just disappeared on me. Do you think there is enough collaboration between Europe and American labs? Asking specifically about these areas because they have the biggest or most popular labs in the world for psychedelics, for example, Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London labs, since they were both working on psilocybin. So the question is there enough collaboration?
My sense of it is that there is, and that there's a lot of collaboration. So for example, with MAPS, as I indicated, phase 3 was Canada, Israel, and Europe. We have done research in multiple countries in Europe to sort of train therapists and prepare the ground. A lot of the companies that are global, so let's say Compass Pathways, which is developing psilocybin, has got a lot of connections and sites in Europe, but they're also working in the United States. So I think that companies tend to think global. They're, like Mark was saying, the strategy may be, let's start with the FDA, but then they're all thinking global. So my sense is that it's an international community of psychedelic researchers. We just had the biggest psychedelic conference in the history of the world in Denver in June with 12,400 people, but we had people, I think it was like 50 different countries or something. So they're all collaborating with each other. So I think that what really is more of the limiting factor is, again, this idea of proprietary information, patents and stuff that's kept secret in order for the patent process. So in that sense, there is not as much collaboration as there could be, but I think that right now I see just free flowing of information to most extent.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I've approached many universities and medical centers in the United States looking for partners to conduct the clinical study in the United States, and I really approached the best of them and got only very positive response. And the 2 clinical sites we are about to have in the United States, one is at Johns Hopkins and the other one is at Yale. So I really, from my experience, a lot of collaboration from those fine institutes.
We have a couple of minutes left. Any very quick comments to make before I say goodbye to you all?
I would like to make a comment. Maybe what I've said could be interpreted as being against patents, but I am for patents for original innovations. So, and I'm for the for-profit companies. I think there's the scale of the healing that's needed is so great that we need the resources that you get from for-profits. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to go ahead and patent original inventions. So maybe my concerns about patents could have been misinterpreted as I'm not sympathetic with them, but I am. And I just hope that over time that we do develop great new drugs that we've never had before, and then we make them legal and I can try them.
That makes at least the 2 of us hoping for the same.
I personally think this is exciting. I honor and respect and bow deeply at the waist to Rick, who has been doing this for decades and has really brought psychedelics onto the public stage. And I also bow deeply at the waist to Adi, who is one of the newer people who is coming down and saying, hey, we have this novel psychedelic. What can we do with this? How are we going to bring this to the people? Because it seems to have some very specific and unique targets that it can be healing around. So I really value this conversation. Thank you guys for being part of it.
Yes, I do too. And I just want to thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you for our audience for joining us. And it really is an exciting conversation. And just so you know, from the PAC perspective, the recording of this conversation will be up on our website probably just before Christmas. And what else I want to say is just to echo what Mark said, just a deep, deep gratitude for your commitment, Rick, and yours, Adi, and just for the way that you bring yourselves to this world, and for your dear hearts You have a lot of intellect and a lot of brain power, but you're coming from your hearts, and that is what is going to change the world. And thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Till the next time.